The Fujifilm X100V. In case you haven't noticed, it's really hard to get in stock this year. People are paying above retail price for this camera. Is it worth all the buzz? Now, you may have also noticed that a lot of YouTubers are falling in love with this camera, and there's a lot of emotion surrounding it. In this review, I'm going to try to keep all that emotion out of it, but I'm still going to give you a lot of information in case you're considering buying the camera about what you should be aware of, what the camera's strengths are, and what may need improvement. And if you already have the camera, I'll give you some nice tips and suggestions on how to make it a more enjoyable experience. Now, in this video, I also want to talk about some features that other YouTubers don't seem to stress, like video performance, for example. You're seeing the video right now. This is being recorded with the camera. So we're going to get into that. Now, you may not be buying the camera specifically for video.
Sorry to interrupt the video, but what just happened was the camera overheated during the recording of this segment. We will get into that a little bit later when we talk about video features. Okay, so now we know the camera is hot, but it's also hot in another way. I know, I said I wasn't going to get emotional in this video, but just this one time. When you actually have the camera in your hands, you'll see it's really as gorgeous as it looks in pictures. It's sexy with a great body. But is it like a beautiful woman whose personality is a
Okay, let's just get some negatives out of the way.
At times when recording video, the scene will quickly lighten and darken, and it can be very annoying, just like it happened right here in this scene. That's called exposure stepping. The camera itself is so small, and that's nice, but you're going to find yourself constantly hitting buttons and inadvertently changing things on the touchscreens. There are a few tricks I can show you which will help that. Like, for example, you go into the menu to lock the focus point so the joystick will not cause the focus point to inadvertently move all the time.
Okay, enough about the bad. Let's talk about the strengths of this camera.
The fixed lens is a 35mm equivalent f2.0. And that lens delivers really nice sharp photos across the frame, in the center, in the corner, and there's a nice minimum focusing distance, so you can do some nice macro. And couple that with the f2.0 lens, even though it's a smaller sensor than a full frame, you can get some nice bokeh and blurred backgrounds. It even makes food look better than it tastes, and garbage never looks so good.
As you know by now, the camera does not have a flip-out screen, it just tilts up. So when I was out at the beautiful Westbury Gardens, I decided to take a selfie just holding the camera at arm's length and seeing what happens. And the camera focused perfectly on me, and you can see the nice blurred background as well.
So that lens is a positive for the camera, but it's a fixed lens, so it also doubles as a bit of a negative. For $1,400, it's only one focal length. Now, a close competitor to this camera is Fujifilm's own X Pro 3, which has an optical viewfinder as well and a vintage feel. But with that camera, you have an interchangeable lens option. But for that price, it doesn't come with any lenses. So now the X100V is starting to look like a pretty good deal when you compare it to the X Pro 3. So just keep in mind that if you're coming from a DSLR system or a mirrorless camera and you're used to changing your lenses and your focal lengths, it may take some getting used to having just this one focal length on this camera. Modern cell phones today, some of them even have 2 or 3 lenses. So why would we get a separate camera with just one lens and one focal length? Does it really make sense? But after using the camera, you'll find this gives you way more flexibility and is a lot more fun to use than a cell phone camera. And the results? Well, you be the judge. When they designed the X100V, street photography was in mind. But if you're a bit of a shy photographer, like I am, the 35mm lens doesn't allow you to get too close to your subjects. so you have to crop in and post at times, which obviously comes with its own cost. But if a camera is going to have a fixed focal length, then 35mm or 50mm is considered the ideal focal length because it mimics what the eye can see. But if you really want to get in a little tighter, you can with this accessory. It'll set you back a few dollars, but still cheaper than buying a separate lens.
One thing I really love about the camera is that it's so small that you could just sort of blend right in. You just, feel like a tourist snapping away, as opposed to some other people that have, big camera gear and it's obvious. Maybe like this guy over here.
What, you think I don't blend in?
No, you're good.
Good.
The camera has no program or aperture priority or shutter priority modes. No, you control everything with the wheels on top of the camera or on the lens itself, which is really cool. But it has the modern convenience of an LCD screen to review your shots after as well, or to use it when shooting. Fujifilm offers a touch-to-shoot function where all you have to do is just touch the LCD screen and the camera takes a picture. But if you have that option set, just be warned, you're going to have a lot of unwanted pictures taken because you'll be touching that screen all over the place and it goes off like crazy. And on the bright side, pun intended, the lens is a fast f2.0. Now a close competitor to the Fuji, the Ricoh GR3X, which is popular for street photography, has an f2.8 lens, a full one stop slower. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
And that camera doesn't even have an electronic viewfinder.
That sucks.
Did someone say viewfinder? Now, besides the really cool looks of the camera, the standout feature is the viewfinder system that comes along with this camera. It's more than meets the eye, no pun intended. You have 3 different modes. You have an optical viewfinder, you have an electronic viewfinder, and you have a hybrid of both. Now, of course, if you're using the optical viewfinder, it is fun and it does feel like you're using a vintage camera. But the negative is you're not going to really be able to tell if you're in focus. You're not going to be able to tell if the exposure is right as you can with an electronic viewfinder, so you sort of have to cross your fingers.
In this example, in the optical viewfinder, the delicat sign looks fine, but when you switch to the electronic mode, you see it's not in focus. But in the hybrid mode, the electronic viewfinder image is in the lower right portion of the screen overlaid on the optical image. It's a little hard to see, but it does give you a better indication of what the scene should look like if you're in optical mode. And in order to switch between the modes, it's simply flicking that lever either left or right on the camera.
And I'm thinking, is this a gimmick using the optical viewfinder? Is it something that you're going to get tired of? And at first I was a little skeptical, but after using it for a while, you really do feel like you're part of the scene. You're not going into an electronic image because it's not an electronic image. The only thing electronic is the overlay, which you can customize, but it does tell you your shutter speed, aperture, and it gives you a framing guide so you can see what is exactly going to be in the image. So some days you may be in the mood to use the optical viewfinder and you can, but maybe you're doing some more critical shooting and you want to go to the electronic viewfinder. It's as easy as a flip of a switch. Good job, Fuji.
Don't let the small size and vintage look of this camera fool you. It's actually pretty advanced. There's a lot of customization and controls, and you can tailor this camera to how you like, both in an electronic way and old school vintage way. How you flip up the ring to control the ISO is very cool. The quick menu is really nice to simplify things, and you can customize that too, which is highly recommended. Fuji is famous for film simulations, and they're all here in this camera. You can have one set for photo mode and one for video mode, and the camera will actually remember that when you go into each of those modes.
Now, the film simulations on this camera are unique to Fuji. They're really great, they're really fun. I mean, what's more interesting than using a retro camera to get retro looking pictures? But you know what I found? That the Fuji color science is just so dialed in, and the colors are so beautiful that most of the time I'm not using the film simulations. So you may want to just think about that when you're out in the field, because if you're shooting JPEGs and you use the film simulations, well, you can't change them later. Unless you shoot RAW and JPEG and the camera does give you an option for that. In that case, you can have the best of both worlds. Of course, it's going to take up a little more storage, but storage is cheap these days, so.
The camera can take pictures in HDR mode to give you better dynamic range. And here's an example with HDR off and on where you could see a little more detail in the sky. And actually a little gimmicky, but the panorama mode does work well, where you sweep the camera along in a certain direction and you will get a nice wide image. Here I think the buildings are a little crooked because I wasn't holding the camera perfectly straight. A feature we're seeing less and less on cameras these days is a built-in flash, and you may not notice it on this camera, but it's there and greatly appreciated. Now, one thing the camera does not have is built-in stabilization, either in the camera or the lens. But the lens is a fast f2.0 lens, so that helps compensate. And it's also a 35mm equivalent lens, so it's not a telephoto lens. So clearly, image stabilization isn't a necessity. It would have been nice, but of course that would have made the camera bigger and heavier. But here are some shots taken at various shutter speeds, and I found that anything under 1/30th of a second really was dicey in terms of holding it steady and getting camera shake. Here are some shots I took perusing around the city in the evening, and some are in focus and some are not, mostly not. At 1/15th of a second, this picture is not exactly cutting edge. When going into the menu to set your ISO preferences, I recommend allowing it to go to the maximum and keep your minimum shutter speed around the 60th. You can always rescue a slightly grainy image, but not so much a blurry image. And you can see, even at higher ISOs, the image holds up well. Okay, we're going to get to the video features now of this camera in a second, but do me a favor, if you're getting something out of this and you're enjoying this, please just hit that like button and do subscribe. We are a growing channel and it really does help support us. So let's take a look at a 4K video using the Eterna film simulation, which is very popular for video. It looks really nice and sharp, but of course you still do see a little shake even at this wide angle. Let's check and see the autofocus in video. Going from near to far. Listen closely, near, for that buzzing sound. That's actually the autofocus motor moving. So at times you may not just hear the buzzing of the bees with this camera. This introduces its own buzz. But speaking of insects with the close focusing ability, you can see these ants getting high on their caffeine. The 4K 30 video produced by this camera is nice and clear and sharp, but I was also very surprised that the 1920 by 1080 video, which you're seeing right now, is also, it looks really almost as good as the 4K. Take a look. So if you are an HD shooter and you don't like 4K, then 1080p is an excellent option for you. There are a couple of slow-mo modes that will record in HD. This is here at the 1/2 speed. There is definitely reduced resolution in this mode, and there is also a 1/4 speed option as well. For a little camera, it packs some pretty big video features like a built-in ND filter, which originally was just for photos, but a firmware update added it for video. There are zebras. No, not those kind. Now, it's weird, there's not a 30-minute recording limit, which you find in a lot of cameras, but a 10-minute limit, so the camera will stop recording after 10 minutes. Now, you can restart again, but if you're going to be doing any long-form like interviews, obviously you're not going to be using this camera for that. But you can use a mic and a headphone, and there is an HDMI out, which actually will output 422 10-bit to an outside recorder. Now, in order to avoid the overheating issue in 4K, which only will give you about a few minutes unless you go into the menu and change the temperature setting, you're going to move it from standard to high, and that'll get you the longer recording time in 4K. After I made that change, the camera did not overheat after a couple of minutes, but it did get really, really warm. So after about 7-8 minutes, I just shut it down manually. I didn't want it to cause any damage. And if you're shooting in 1080p, the camera does not get that warm, and there doesn't seem to be any overheating issues. And while we're talking about quirks, so where's the record button to record video? Well, there isn't one. You have to go into the drive mode and change it to movie. So that's kind of annoying. It takes some time, and I could not find a way to quickly customize that in the menu. So you're going to have to get used to that. If you switch between photos and videos, it can be a little annoying. But on a positive note, once you are actually shooting movies, the video is sharp, clear, crisp, and amazingly solid coming from a camera this small.
Before we wrap it up for this video, let me just give you some additional tips. The camera is not fully weather sealed. The area around the lens is not, so just be careful. Do not go underwater with the camera or don't have it for prolonged periods in the rain. Now, since the LCD screen is always going to be exposed, I recommend a screen protector. You can still use the touch screen function just fine, it works. Through my experimentation, I found that the colors and picture is gorgeous, but in some cases the contrast is just a little too high and your dark areas get crushed.
So what I did was go into the menu, into the tone curve section, and in the shadows, I dropped it down to -1. And what I found was this sort of gave me a little more detail in the darkest portion of the image, as you can see here from this example.
You're going to want to carry around an extra battery. The battery indicator isn't 100% accurate. It may tell you you've got a half a charge, and then all of a sudden it's red and you're down to nothing. So these things are not 100% accurate and you don't want to be disappointed. So they're small enough, carry around an extra battery or two.
In addition to customizing the buttons and dials, you can also customize the manual focusing ring when you're not in manual focus mode. I used it for the film simulations. And just so you know, when you set your ISO setting maximums, there's actually 3 presets, so you can use 1 or 2 for daytime and then nighttime. This way you can be more flexible in terms of how high you want your ISO to go depending on the lighting. And speaking about brightness, if you're going to be in bright sun, then I would recommend changing your LCD setting in the menu to maximum. It really does make a difference in terms of viewability of the LCD screen. And I tested it out actually on a bright sunny day at the beach, and I could see the screen just fine.
So the Fuji X100 V, well, my channel, Tech to Remember, in case you're not familiar with it, reviews vintage technology and also modern cameras as well. So, I mean, this camera actually is perfect. So I had to get my hands on it, and I'm glad I did. The Fuji X100 V, you know, it's a deceptive camera. I mean that in a good way. It packs a lot of features in such a small body and really delivers incredible images. But do me a favor and avoid the temptation of putting the camera in your pocket. Some people may get the wrong idea. Thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.